All right, get ready, because today we're going deep into something that's everywhere in the U.S., race and ethnicity.
Yeah, it's a big one.
You sent over this sociology chapter, and wow, just looking it over, I think this deep dive is going to be a real eye-opener.
I think so, too.
We're going to be figuring out those tricky definitions that sociologists use.
Right, because they can be pretty slippery.
Totally. And then we'll look at how different theories view this whole thing.
And how they can help us make sense of it all.
Exactly. Oh, and then we're going to get into how different ethnic groups experience life in the U.S.
Yeah, the different ways it all plays out in different communities.
Okay, so flipping through the chapter, I was really struck by this concept of a model minority and how something that seems positive on the surface can actually be kind of harmful.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than it seems at first glance.
Right. And then there's this weird connection the chapter makes between the Irish potato famine, way back when, and how racial stereotypes developed in America.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
I know. And get this, even the term Native American can be misleading.
Really?
Yeah, it's like calling everyone from Spain to Russia just European.
Ah, I see what you mean. It lumps everyone together.
Exactly.
So lots to unpack here.
For sure. And to help us unpack all of this, I've got an expert on board. They know the sociology of race and ethnicity like the back of their hand, and they're here to give us some context and, well, analyze everything.
I'll do my best. These are really important topics, especially if we really want to understand them, beyond just scratching the surface.
Exactly. I mean, we use terms like race, ethnicity, and minority group all the time.
Right.
But this chapter really made it clear that sociologists have like a much deeper understanding of these things. It's way more nuanced.
For sure. You're absolutely right. There's a tendency to use those terms as if they're the same thing.
Yeah.
But for sociologists, they have really specific meanings. And those meanings help us see how complex social dynamics really are.
So let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What's race? Like, how would a sociologist define that?
Okay, so think of it this way. Race is basically all about those superficial physical differences that a society decides are important.
Okay.
And here's the key. Race is like this moving target. It's not based on hard science. It's a social construct.
So it changes over time.
Exactly. The way we've categorized race has changed a lot, naturally.
Yeah.
Moving away from those old, rigid biological categories.
Like Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian.
Exactly. Thankfully, modern science has, debunked those old ideas.
Yeah.
And now sociologists are much more interested in understanding, how societies attach meaning to certain physical traits and how those meanings then shape, how we interact with each other and how those meanings shape social structures.
Okay, that makes sense. So if race is about those socially constructed categories,
Right,
based on physical traits, where does ethnicity fit into all of this?
So ethnicity goes beyond just what you look like. It gets into shared culture, all the practices, the values, beliefs, language, traditions, all that stuff that binds a group of people together.
Okay.
It's that sense of belonging that comes from shared heritage and cultural experiences.
So ethnicity is kind of like the glue.
You could say that.
Yeah.
The glue that holds a group together.
Yeah.
Beyond just their physical traits, yeah.
Got it. So race is about those often arbitrary, I guess.
Yeah.
Physical distinctions, and ethnicity is more about that shared cultural fabric.
That's a great way to put it.
What about minority groups? That was something that really stuck out to me in this chapter.
Yeah.
The way it defines them by their lack of power,
Yeah.
not just their size.
That's a super important distinction. A minority group, sometimes called a subordinate group in sociology, isn't just about being outnumbered.
Right.
It's about experiencing systemic disadvantage and unequal treatment based on their physical or cultural traits. It's about where they stand in the power structure. It doesn't matter if they're a big group or a small group.
So you could have a group that's a big part of the population, but they could still be a minority group because they don't have power.
Absolutely. A good example is elderly people in the U.S. They're definitely not a numerical minority, but they can face prejudice and discrimination because of their age, and that can lead to a lower social standing. One stat that really hit me is that 10% of nursing home staff admitted to physically abusing an elderly person in the past year.
Wow, it's
Yeah.
kind of scary.
It is. And it's a powerful example of how being vulnerable and lacking power can make a group a minority, even if they're a large part of the population.
Makes you think. Okay, so we've got these definitions down, but how do sociologists actually make sense of all of this? The chapter talks about these different theoretical perspectives, and they offer like different lenses to look at these issues through.
Yeah, it's like having different tools. You've got functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And each one offers a particular way of understanding how race and ethnicity work in society. It has different questions.
Right.
And emphasize different parts of how things work.
Okay, let's start with functionalism. What's that all about?
So functionalism basically tries to understand how each part of society contributes to the whole, how it contributes to stability and how society functions. Think of it like a machine where every piece has a specific job, and that keeps things running smoothly.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to race and ethnicity, functionalists want to understand how those categories, even with all the inequalities they bring, might serve some purpose in keeping the social order. It may sound counterintuitive.
So we're saying that racism could actually be functional.
That's what functionalists would say, yeah. And it's obviously a controversial idea. They're not saying racism is good, of course.
Yeah.
But they're trying to understand how it operates within a larger social system. For example, sociologist Arnold Nash, he argued that racism can benefit the dominant group by justifying why they have unequal access to resources and power.
So it's a way of explaining or even justifying why things stay unequal.
Right. It's definitely a disturbing idea, but it helps to understand why inequalities can last for generations.
Yeah, that makes sense, even though it's, well, not a very happy thought.
No, it's not.
Okay, so what about conflict theory?
So conflict theory basically takes a completely different approach.
Okay.
Instead of stability, it focuses on power struggles and inequalities.
Right.
It shines a light on competition for resources and those conflicts between different groups.
Yeah.
And it really looks at how power is used to keep things unequal.
Okay, so if you apply that to race and ethnicity, conflict theory would say that those historical conflicts between the dominant group, white people in the case of the U.S., and racial and ethnic minorities, they have shaped basically everything about American society.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding how those historical conflicts led to the systems of oppression and privilege that we see today. Conflict theorists would say that these systems aren't just random, they're the result of what powerful people did on purpose to keep their advantages.
Okay. And the chapter mentions this term, intersectionality. It says it's a key part of conflict theory. Can you explain what that is?
So intersectionality is a concept that sociologist Patricia Hill Collins developed. And it basically says that we can't look at categories like race, gender, and class as totally separate things.
Right.
They intersect, they overlap, and they create these really unique experiences for people based on how those categories come together.
So like a black woman might experience discrimination differently from a black man or a white woman.
Exactly. Intersectionality helps us understand that how much someone experiences oppression or privilege is actually shaped by all those social identities combined. It really adds another layer to understanding inequality and how different forms of oppression can be connected.
Yeah, it's like a Venn diagram where the circles of race, gender, and class all overlap.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered functionalism and conflict theory. What's the deal with symbolic interactionism?
So symbolic interactionism zooms in on the individual and how they make sense of their world through interactions and symbols.
Okay.
It's all about how we use symbols, language, gestures, all that to communicate, to create meaning, and to have these shared understandings.
So like how certain clothes or music or even ways of speaking become associated with certain racial or ethnic groups?
That's a great example, yeah. And then those associations, whether they're accurate or not, can influence how we see people and how we interact with them.
Makes sense.
A symbolic interactionist might ask how all those seemingly tiny everyday interactions end up building into those big patterns of prejudice and discrimination that we see in society. They'd say those individual actions are like the building blocks of those larger social structures.
So like our individual choices are either strengthening those systems of inequality or challenging them every day, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly.
Okay, so to recap, functionalism looks at how social structures function.
Right.
Conflict theory looks at power struggles. And symbolic interactionism focuses on how individuals create meaning through interactions. They each offer a different piece of the puzzle.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. And if we consider all those perspectives, we can get a fuller picture of how race and ethnicity actually work in the real world. They aren't separate ideas.
Right.
They work together to help us understand.
This chapter also talks about the darker side of things, like prejudice, discrimination, and racism. These terms are often used as if they're the same thing, but the chapter actually makes some important distinctions between them. Can you help us break down those differences?
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial to understand the difference between those terms. It really helps us talk about these issues more clearly and in a more informed way.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, let's start with stereotypes. Those are those oversimplified generalizations about entire groups of people. They can be based on anything, really. Race, ethnicity, gender, you name it. They're like mental shortcuts, and they help us categorize people quickly, but they often use faulty logic and inaccurate information.
And what's really interesting is how those stereotypes get recycled and repurposed for new groups that are marginalized. It's like they're passed down from generation to generation, and they change to fit the new social landscape.
Exactly. The chapter mentions how some stereotypes that were used to describe Irish immigrants way back in the day, like lazy, unintelligent, prone to criminality, are now being used against newer immigrant groups today. It shows how these prejudiced ideas can be so deeply ingrained and how they can easily be adapted to target different groups.
Yeah, it's a reminder that those harmful stereotypes are usually more about power dynamics and social anxieties than any real traits of the group being targeted.
Exactly. They're about keeping those social hierarchies in place and justifying inequality. Okay, so now prejudice takes those stereotypes a step further. It's the biased thinking, those preconceived notions about a group that aren't based on personal experience. They're based on those stereotypes.
So prejudice is the attitude, the feeling, the predisposition to judge someone based on what group they're part of, even if you've never actually met them or anything.
Exactly. And the chapter points out how prejudice can actually be fueled by confirmation bias, that tendency to only look for information that confirms what you already believe.
Right.
So if you already have a negative view of a group, any negative action by a member of that group just reinforces that bias for you, even if it's not statistically significant.
It's like seeing what you want to see.
Yes.
Even if it's not the whole picture.
Right.
But prejudice is still like in the realm of thoughts and feelings. Discrimination is where it turns into action.
Precisely. Discrimination is when those beliefs turn into actions against a group. And it can happen in different ways, from individual acts of bias to systemic discrimination that's built into institutions.
Like refusing to give someone a job or a place to live based on their race or ethnicity.
Exactly. It can be as blatant as those signs from the past that said, "Help wanted, no Irish need apply," or as subtle as unconscious bias during the hiring process. Discrimination is about denying equal opportunity and perpetuating inequality.
Okay, so then there's racism, which feels like the heaviest term of all. What makes racism different from prejudice and discrimination?
So racism goes beyond individual prejudice or discrimination. It's about using those prejudices to justify a system of inequality that benefits one race over another. It's about saying one race is superior and using that belief to justify unequal treatment and access to power.
So it's not just individual acts, it's about how those prejudices actually become part of institutions and social structures.
Exactly. The chapter breaks this down into different types of racism.
Oh.
You have individual racism, like telling a racist joke. But then you have systemic racism, where entire institutions are set up in a way that disadvantages certain groups. Think about racial profiling, school systems with unequal funding, or the lasting effects of historical racism, like slavery and segregation. It's woven into the fabric of our society.
So even if people don't consciously believe racist things, they might still be participating in and benefiting from a system that creates racial inequality.
Exactly. It's important to see how those individual acts of racism feed into and reinforce those bigger systems of oppression. The chapter also talks about other forms of racism like cultural racism and colorism.
Can you explain those quickly?
Yeah, cultural racism is about assuming that one culture is better than others. It often looks like believing that some cultural practices are more civilized or advanced, and then using that belief to justify discrimination and inequality.
Okay.
Colorism is prejudice within a racial group that's based on skin tone, like favoring lighter skin over darker skin. It's basically internalized racism, and it can be super damaging.
So it's like even within racial groups, there's hierarchy based on how close people are to whiteness or Eurocentric beauty standards.
You got it. It's about understanding how racism operates on many levels, between groups and within groups.
This is a lot, but it's really important to know. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork with definitions. We looked at those theoretical frameworks. We've even gotten into the more negative aspects of how groups relate to each other. I think now it's time to talk about how groups coexist. The chapter lays out all these different possibilities, ranging from pluralism, which sounds ideal, to the horrors of genocide.
It's a pretty wide spectrum, for sure. It really shows all the different ways societies have dealt with diversity, from embracing it to trying to eliminate it.
Okay, so let's start with pluralism. What's that like?
Pluralism is like that salad bowl analogy we often hear.
Right.
It's the idea that all these different cultures can exist together, and they keep their unique identities while still being part of society as a whole, like a mosaic. Where each piece is unique, but they all make a beautiful picture together.
It sounds great in theory, but is it really possible? I mean, societies are rarely that harmonious, right?
You're right. True pluralism takes real effort.
Yeah.
You have to create a society where power is shared equally,
Hmm.
and where all different groups have the same access to resources and opportunities. That's hard to do, especially in societies that have a history of inequality. But it's definitely something to strive for.
Absolutely. So if pluralism is the ideal, what's the opposite end of that spectrum? What happens when there's no tolerance or respect?
Unfortunately, the opposite end of that spectrum is genocide. The deliberate and systematic attempt to wipe out an entire group of people.
Right.
It's the most extreme form of intolerance we can imagine.
The Holocaust is the most obvious example.
Yeah.
But unfortunately not the only one. The chapter also mentions the genocide of Native Americans, even though it wasn't always intentional.
Right. Sometimes genocide is a deliberate act of extermination.
Right.
But sometimes it can happen because of policies and practices that weren't designed to wipe out a group but end up having that effect.
Right.
Like the forced displacement of Native Americans from their land, or introducing European diseases that decimated their population.
It's a reminder that even actions that aren't meant to be malicious can be really devastating.
Yeah.
Especially when they're driven by ignorance, or when people just don't understand how their actions will affect vulnerable groups.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to understand history and how past actions continue to affect the present.
Okay, so we have pluralism on one end and genocide on the other.
Right.
What are some of the points in between those two extremes?
Well, one is assimilation.
Okay.
That's where a minority group slowly starts to adopt the dominant culture. It's often seen as a one-way street where the minority group loses parts of its own culture in order to fit in.
So like immigrants learning the language and customs of their new country.
Exactly.
It's like trading one culture for another.
Right. While assimilation can help immigrants integrate into a new society, it can also mean that cultural diversity gets eroded.
Right?
And the minority group might feel a sense of loss.
So assimilation is about adopting the dominant culture. What's amalgamation?
Amalgamation is more like the melting analogy.
Okay.
It's about different cultures coming together and forming a new hybrid culture. It's not about one group absorbing another. It's about creating something completely new from the contributions of multiple groups.
So intermarriage would be a good example of that.
Yeah.
Two cultures combining to create a family with this blended cultural heritage.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got pluralism, assimilation, amalgamation, and genocide. Are there any other types of relationships between groups we need to know about?
There's expulsion, which is basically forcing a group to leave an area.
Oh, right.
Think of the Trail of Tears, where Native American tribes were forced to leave their land.
Right.
Or the Japanese internment camps in World War II.
Those are such awful examples of how fear and prejudice can lead to suffering and the displacement of whole communities.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in places that say they value freedom and equality, those values can be forgotten really quickly when people are afraid of what's different.
Right. And then there's segregation.
Right.
Which means separating groups physically,
Yes.
whether that's in housing, education, or public places.
It's important to remember that segregation can be de jure, which means it's enforced by law, like with Jim Crow laws in the South, or it can be de facto, which means it happens in reality, even if it's not written into law. Both ways, it's about creating separate and unequal places based on race or ethnicity.
So even if segregation is illegal, it can still exist in more subtle ways, like with housing patterns or unequal access to things.
Exactly. And de facto segregation is usually harder to address because it's rooted in these really deep social and economic inequalities that are hard to dismantle.
Right.
It's about realizing that injustice in the past still shapes the present.
This whole range of ways that groups relate is really interesting. It shows how complex human interactions are.
For sure.
And it shows all the different possibilities, from getting along really well to really violent conflict. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But it's also important for understanding how we connect as humans.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the historical and social forces that shape those connections.
Right.
And it's about recognizing our own role in either continuing those patterns or changing them.
So now I think it's time to get more specific. The chapter talks about the experiences of different ethnic groups in the U.S.
Right.
It touches on Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, white ethnic Americans, and Hispanic Americans. It shows how diverse the U.S. is.
It does.
But it also highlights those unique challenges each group has dealt with, trying to find their place in American society. Are you ready to dive into those?
I am. I think it's really important to move beyond just those broad categories.
Right.
And look at how different groups have actually been treated and how those experiences still affect them today.
Let's start with Native Americans. They have a unique place in American history because they're the only group that's not immigrants.
Right.
But they've also been oppressed and marginalized for centuries. It's a complicated and sad history.
It is.
And it's key to understanding how race and ethnicity work in the U.S.
Absolutely. Their story is part of the very foundation of this country. And it's a story that's often been ignored or misrepresented. Even the term Native American can be misleading. It lumps together so many different tribal nations.
Yeah, each with their own unique cultures, languages, and histories.
Exactly. It's like calling everyone from Spain to Russia just European. It erases those important differences and ignores all the richness and diversity of their cultures.
And that erasure is part of that larger history of forced assimilation and cultural genocide that Native Americans have endured. For centuries, the U.S. government has enacted policies to take away their land, their culture, and their sovereignty.
That's true.
This chapter mentions things like the Indian Removal Act, the Indian Appropriation Acts, and the Dawes Act, which all contributed to the displacement and disenfranchisement of Native Americans.
Yeah, and we can't forget about those horrific boarding schools that were designed to civilize Native American children by forcing them to give up their language, their religion, and their culture.
Oh, yeah.
It was a brutal attempt to erase their identities and force them to conform to white Eurocentric standards.
It's hard to imagine the trauma inflicted on generations of Native American children. It's only recently that people have started to try to revive and preserve those indigenous cultures and languages that were almost wiped out.
It's a long and ongoing process of healing and reclaiming their stolen traditions. But even with those efforts, Native Americans still face big challenges. Poverty, unemployment, and health problems are much higher for them. And they're still fighting for the government to recognize their treaty rights and their sovereignty as tribal nations.
It just shows that the impact of colonialism and oppression is still being felt by Native Americans today. Their struggle for justice is ongoing.
It is.
And it's a story that all Americans need to hear and understand.
Yes.
It's a really crucial part of understanding race and ethnicity in the United States.
Understanding their history and their current struggles is essential to understanding how race and power work in this country.
Okay, let's move on to another group whose history in the U.S. can't be separated from slavery, African Americans. Their story is a powerful example of resilience in the face of incredible hardship.
You can't talk about race and ethnicity in the U.S. without talking about the role that African Americans have played. Their story is one of pain and struggle, but also one of strength, resilience, and a rich cultural heritage.
And even the term African American can be tricky, right?
It can be.
Not every Black person in the U.S. uses that label for themselves.
Right. Some prefer to identify with their specific country of origin or their specific heritage. And some people prefer the term Black.
Okay.
To acknowledge the shared experience of racial oppression. It's about respecting how people choose to define themselves.
This chapter really delves into the horrors of slavery and the systemic racism that was all over American society for hundreds of years. It's a harsh reminder that racial inequality has deep roots in this country. It's not something we can ignore or downplay.
Absolutely not. Slavery wasn't just about economics. It was a system that controlled people based on their race. It was meant to dehumanize and exploit Black people. And the effects of that system are still felt by African Americans today, even though it was abolished over 150 years ago.
It's like that trauma is embedded in the very fabric of African American communities, passed down over generations.
Right. And then the Jim Crow era, with those laws enforcing segregation, just made those inequalities even worse. It was a system designed to keep Black people subordinate, denying them basic rights and opportunities.
And even though the civil rights movement led to important legal and social changes, like getting rid of those Jim Crow laws and securing voting rights, the fight for racial equality isn't over.
It's definitely not over.
We still see differences in education, healthcare, the justice system, and economic opportunities.
All right.
Those oppressive systems may have changed and become more subtle, but they haven't gone away, and they still hurt Black people in a lot of ways.
It's about recognizing that while progress has been made, we have a long way to go to achieve true equality.
Barack Obama being elected the first Black president was definitely a sign of progress.
Was.
But this chapter points out that he still faced a lot of racism during his time as president.
He did. His election was a huge moment in American history, but it didn't magically erase centuries of prejudice and discrimination. His experience shows how hard it is to achieve real equality in America and how important it is to stay aware and keep fighting.
It's like even the highest office in the country doesn't protect Black people from racism.
That's true.
Okay, let's switch gears to Asian Americans, another group with a rich and varied history in the U.S.
Right. It's a really broad category. It includes people from all over Asia, each with their own unique culture and experiences.
Yeah. We can't lump them all together as one group.
Definitely not.
This chapter mentions how Chinese immigrants were some of the first Asians to come to the U.S. in big numbers, drawn by the gold rush and the need for workers to build the railroad. They were crucial to the development of the American West, but their work was often overlooked.
Yeah, and they faced intense discrimination,
Right.
leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which basically shut down Chinese immigration for a long time. It's a perfect example of how economic fear and racial prejudice can result in policies that target specific groups.
Wow.
It's a reminder that we have to be very careful about those patterns of exclusion because history often repeats itself.
Right. Japanese immigrants had their own set of challenges, too, like the California Alien Land Law in 1913, which didn't let them own land, and the awful experience of Japanese internment during World War II.
Those internment camps were completely wrong. They were a violation of civil liberties, a terrible chapter in American history.
Yeah.
They show how quickly fear and prejudice can destroy democratic values and lead to innocent people being locked up just because of their ethnicity.
It's something we have to remember. And we also can't forget about the waves of Asian immigrants who came later, from Korea, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia, many of whom came as refugees escaping war and political turmoil.
Each wave had its own challenges and opportunities. They've all enriched American culture in countless ways, but they've also had to navigate a society that often sees them through this model minority lens, which can be problematic.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. What's wrong with the idea of a model minority? It seems like a positive stereotype praising Asian Americans for their smarts and success.
It does, doesn't it?
But this chapter says it's actually harmful.
It is. It's dangerous because it creates these unrealistic expectations and ignores the real struggles a lot of Asian Americans face. It also pits minorities against each other, saying that if one group can succeed, the other should be able to too, without taking into account the systemic obstacles they face.
It's like saying, well, they did it, so why can't you?
Exactly.
It ignores the history of discrimination and the discrimination that other groups still experience today.
Yes.
No.
It's a way of upholding white supremacy by suggesting that anyone can succeed if they just work hard enough. It completely oversimplifies things and ignores the complexities of race and inequality.
And it also erases the diversity within the Asian American community itself.
Of course.
Yeah.
Not all Asian Americans are high-achieving professionals. There are so many different experiences and socioeconomic backgrounds. Reducing them to one stereotype ignores their individuality and the richness of their experiences.
This seems like a good place to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive. We've covered those key definitions, looked at the different theories sociologists use, and started to see the complexities of how groups relate to each other. We've even started to delve into those different experiences of specific groups in the U.S., highlighting the diversity and the challenges within those broader categories.
Yeah, it's been a lot, but really important to understand.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue this exploration and see how different groups have navigated their journey in American society.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Ready to dive back into those diverse American stories.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how each group's experience is shaped by those larger historical forces we talked about earlier.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's shift our focus now to white ethnic Americans.
Okay.
It might seem a little counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
Since white usually means the dominant group. But the history of white ethnic Americans, especially those who immigrated in the 19th and early 20th centuries, is full of prejudice and discrimination and struggles to assimilate.
It is.
It's easy to forget that whiteness itself is a fluid concept.
Right.
It's changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious how those groups we think of as white today, how did they become part of that dominant category?
It's an interesting process for sure. Whiteness isn't static. It's been shaped by social and historical forces. Different groups had to fight to be included and accepted, and their stories tell us a lot about how power dynamics play out in the U.S.
So we're talking about groups like German, Irish, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants.
Exactly. Groups that are considered white today, but weren't always seen that way.
Right, when they first arrived.
Yeah, they were often viewed as outsiders. Even threats when they first came here. Think about all the ways of anti-immigrant sentiment throughout U.S. history.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's look at some of their specific experiences. What challenges did those groups face?
Well, German immigrants, particularly those who came in the mid-19th century, often had a bit of an easier time assimilating than others. They settled in their own communities, a lot of them in the Midwest, and they held on to some of their cultural differences.
Right, like those German communities in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Where they were able to keep their language and traditions.
Yeah. But even they weren't immune to discrimination.
Right.
Think about World War I and World War II.
Oh, yeah.
Anti-German feeling was really high. Even those who had been in the U.S. for generations suddenly became suspicious, just because of their heritage.
Yeah. It shows how quickly things can change. Even for those who are accepted, they can be targeted when nationalism rises or when there's social anxiety. Their acceptance is fragile.
It highlights that constant push and pull of identity for immigrant groups. They're always trying to prove they belong, even while facing suspicion and hostility. The Irish, they had a particularly tough time.
Oh, yeah?
Many came here really poor, escaping the potato famine back in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how desperate they must have felt.
Leaving everything behind to try and find a better life, only to be met with such hostility when they arrived.
Exactly.
They were seen as a burden, pushed into low-paying and dangerous jobs, and they were subject to intense prejudice. You'd see them depicted as lazy, dumb criminals in cartoons and media.
Weren't those the same stereotypes used to justify enslaving Black people?
Exactly. It shows how prejudice can shift and adapt to target whoever is convenient at the time. It's about those in power maintaining their control and justifying inequality, no matter who they're targeting.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the people in power often turn marginalized groups against each other, creating this divide and conquer situation that benefits them.
That's a great way to put it.
What about Italian immigrants? Did they face similar things?
Oh, absolutely. Especially those arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were often lumped in with poverty, crime, and dangerous political ideas. Plus, a lot of them were Catholic, and that made them different in a mostly Protestant society, leading to even more suspicion and discrimination.
It's interesting how religion has played such a big role in how different groups interact in the U.S. It really complicates that melting pot idea and highlights those tensions between cultural and religious groups.
For sure, it adds a whole other layer of complexity to what it means to be American.
Right. Okay, what about Eastern European immigrants? What was their experience like?
They faced a lot of hurdles, too, often arriving with limited English and facing discrimination in housing and employment. And a lot of them were Jewish, escaping persecution, only to find anti-Semitism in the U.S., too.
It's just tragic.
It is.
They escaped one kind of oppression only to run into another in their new home. It makes you wonder if the promise of America ever really holds true for people who don't fit the dominant mold.
Yeah, their stories really challenge our understanding of whiteness in America. It shows that even groups we consider white today had to fight to be accepted. And that acceptance came with a lot of discrimination and prejudice. It makes you think about how different things might be if those groups had worked together to challenge the power structure.
Instead of just trying to fit in.
Right.
That's such an interesting thought. It really makes you think about the potential for solidarity and different groups working together.
It's about recognizing that those divisions often benefit those in power.
Okay, we've talked about Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and white ethnic Americans. Let's wrap up this section by talking about Hispanic Americans. Another diverse group.
Incredibly diverse.
People from all over Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right, it's a huge category.
How do we even start to understand a group that's so big and varied?
Well, first, we have to remember that Hispanic is a label that covers lots of different national and cultural identities. We have to acknowledge that diversity. We can't just make generalizations about the whole group. Some people prefer to identify with their specific country of origin, like Mexican-American or Cuban-American.
And the chapter actually uses those two groups as examples to show the range of experiences within the larger Hispanic American community because they have such immigration histories and have been treated very differently in the U.S.
Exactly.
It's a smart way to show how complex things are within those bigger categories and how history and politics shape the immigrant experience.
For sure.
Let's start with Mexican Americans. They have a long and complicated history here in the U.S., tied up with labor, immigration, and cultural identity.
Yeah, they've been migrating to the U.S. for centuries, driven by economic factors, political policies, and changing social attitudes. In the early 20th century, that migration was often circular. Workers would come to the U.S. for seasonal jobs and then go back to Mexico.
It was like this flow back and forth across the border, depending on what the American economy needed.
Exactly. But then border enforcement got tighter.
Right.
And that back and forth movement became harder, which led to more people settling permanently in the U.S.
And that shift has fueled the current debates about immigration, especially around undocumented immigrants, many of whom are of Mexican descent.
It's become a really politically charged issue, often framed as us against them, with not a lot of room for understanding or empathy.
Right.
It's important to remember that Mexican immigrants, both documented and undocumented, have really contributed a lot to the U.S., to our economy and our culture. They're part of what makes up this country.
Okay, what about Cuban Americans?
Well, the biggest wave of Cuban immigration came after Fidel Castro took over in 1959. Many were escaping his communist regime, looking for political asylum and economic opportunity.
So unlike Mexican immigrants who were often looking for jobs, Cuban immigrants were fleeing political persecution.
Exactly. And because they were escaping communism, they were often welcomed as refugees, given special status and access to resources and support that other immigrant groups didn't always get.
Wow, that's a big difference. It shows how political ideas can really shape immigration policies and how different groups are treated.
Absolutely. It shows how the political context influences how people see immigrants and how those views turn into real policies and opportunities.
So we see this really stark contrast between Mexican Americans, who have often faced hostility and discrimination, and Cuban Americans, who have been more readily accepted and integrated. It's a powerful example of how different historical and political circumstances can shape the immigrant experience.
It really highlights the fact that there isn't just one immigrant story.
Right.
Each group's experience is unique, is shaped by all sorts of factors. We need to keep that in mind when we talk about immigration. And remember that even within these groups, there's a lot of diversity. Not all Mexican Americans have the same experience. And not all Cuban Americans are successful entrepreneurs.
Right. It's about seeing those individual stories within the larger group narrative.
Exactly.
We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the basic definitions to how societies deal with diversity and those unique experiences of different ethnic groups in the U.S. It's been really eye-opening to see how history, power, and prejudice have shaped America.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And challenging. But understanding these historical and social forces is key to building a more just and equal society.
And this chapter doesn't just give us information. It encourages us to think about our own roles in either perpetuating or dismantling those systems of inequality.
It does. It's a call to action, reminding us that we're not just watching these issues unfold, we're part of them.
Yeah, and our choices matter.
Yeah. And the chapter highlights the work of Ibram X. Kendi, who says being anti-racist is a constant process.
It is.
A commitment to looking at our own biases and working to change those systems that keep racial inequality going.
Kenny says it's not enough to just not be racist. You have to be actively anti-racist.
It means taking concrete steps to fight those systems of oppression, both personally and at a societal level.
And the chapter gives us some concrete steps we can all take, like learning about the history of racism, speaking up against racist ideas when we hear them, and pushing for policies that promote racial justice.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we all have a part to play in creating a fairer world.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, like those systems are just too big to change.
It can feel that way.
But every little thing we do helps. Even small actions contribute to the bigger movement for social change.
Exactly. It's about chipping away at those structures of inequality little by little.
And it's crucial to remember that you're not alone in this. There are so many people and groups out there fighting for racial justice and trying to create a more equal world.
It's true.
Find those communities. connect with people who share your passion, and support the people on the front lines of this fight.
I think that's great advice.
This deep dive has given us the knowledge to really engage with these issues in a more informed way.
It's challenged us to think critically.
And it's made us think about our own roles in building a more just world.
Absolutely. We've explored the history, looked at the theories, and learned about the different experiences of various groups in the U.S.
Now it's up to each of us to take what we've learned and use it
to make a difference.
Welcome back for the final part of this deep dive. I have to say, it's really amazing how much we've learned about race and ethnicity in the United States just from this one chapter.
Yeah, we've been through a lot, haven't we?
From those basic definitions to the different theories and then all those stories, it's been quite the journey.
It has. And it's one thing to understand the terms and concepts,
Yeah.
But it's a whole other thing to connect them to the real lives and experiences of different groups throughout American history.
Right. And that was something this chapter really drove home for me.
Me too.
Understanding race and ethnicity isn't just about knowing facts.
It's not. It's about using that knowledge to make a difference and create a more just world. It's about recognizing how these forces shape our own lives. No matter who we are, whether we're part of the dominant group or a marginalized group, we all fit into these systems somehow. And if we want to challenge how oppression works, we have to understand how power works.
One of the things that really stood out to me was how much these categories, race and ethnicity, how fluid they are.
Yeah.
They aren't fixed or biological.
Right.
They're made up by society, and they've changed over time.
That's such an important point. We talk about race like it's this set-in-stone thing, but it's actually a product of our history and social forces. Remember those old categories we talked about?
Like Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian.
Yeah, exactly. They sound ridiculous now.
They do.
But people used to think they were scientific fact.
Wow. It makes you realize that those seemingly objective categories were really just about power.
Yeah. About who's in control and who gets to decide how society works.
And that's why it's so important to be careful about those categories.
Right.
Not making assumptions about people based just on their race or ethnicity.
We need to see each other as individuals, not just as members of a group. Just because people share some experiences of oppression doesn't mean they're all the same.
So true. We have to remember that those categories can be used to create hierarchies.
Right.
And to justify inequality. And history shows that people in power have often used these categories to maintain their own advantage and to keep others down. The entire history of the U.S. is full of these power struggles, with dominant groups using race and ethnicity as tools of control and exclusion. It makes you realize that these patterns of oppression don't just magically go away on their own. We have to actively fight against them.
And that's where the idea of being anti-racist comes in. It's not enough to just be aware of these things or to say, oh, I'm not racist. It takes real effort and a commitment to challenging those systems that create inequality, both in our own lives and in society as a whole.
Yeah, we have to recognize that we all play a part in making a more just world. This chapter had some really good suggestions for concrete steps we can take, like learning about the history of racism, calling out racist ideas when we hear them, and supporting policies that fight for racial equality.
And I think it's important to remember that this work can be hard, emotionally, I mean.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It can be tiring, to constantly face those injustices.
Right.
And to challenge these systems of oppression. It's important to have support, to find people who understand the challenges and the rewards of this work.
Yeah, that's really important. This work isn't easy.
It's not.
And it's normal to feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's okay to feel frustrated sometimes. It's about finding those places where you can recharge, connect with people who get it.
Yeah. And it's also important to remember that change doesn't always happen in a straight line.
Right.
There will be times when things go backward, but you have to keep going. Stay engaged.
Yeah.
Never lose hope that a better world is possible.
I love that. Holding on to that hope is so important. And I think celebrating those little victories is important, too.
Absolutely.
Even small wins can give us the energy to keep pushing for bigger change.
It's about recognizing those moments of progress and letting them fuel our efforts.
Okay, so as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways.
Sounds good.
First, remember that race and ethnicity are complicated and they're always changing. There are no easy answers, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand them.
Exactly.
Second, we have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases. We all have blind spots, and it's up to us to see them and work to dismantle those systems of inequality.
And finally, remember that you're not alone in this. There are so many people and organizations fighting for racial justice and equality.
Yeah.
Find your community, connect with those who share your passion,
All right.
and support those who are leading the way.
This deep dive has given us the knowledge and tools to engage with these issues in a real and meaningful way. It's made us question what we thought we knew.
And hopefully it's inspired you to work towards a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world.